In the years before the revolution began, France was a country of beauty, tradition, and quiet imbalance. To imagine it, we might picture wide fields stretching under a soft summer sky, villages where church bells marked the passing of time, and the great city of Paris, with its markets, narrow streets, and stone bridges crossing the River Seine. It was a land where history seemed deeply rooted, where castles and cathedrals rose high above the countryside, reminders of centuries of kings and queens, battles and victories, prayers and festivals. Yet beneath this familiar rhythm, there were differences in how people lived, differences so wide and so steady that they shaped every part of daily life. French society was divided into what were called the three estates. The first estate was the clergy, the priests and bishops who served the church, a powerful institution that guided not only faith, but education and charity. They lived in relative comfort, and though some priests were simple and close to their communities, others, especially the higher clergy, enjoyed privileges and wealth. The second estate was the nobility, families who traced their names through generations, who lived in fine houses, sometimes in the city, sometimes in country estates surrounded by land. They held important positions in the army, the court, and the government, and many of them lived lives of ease compared to those who tilled the fields or worked in trades. The third estate was everyone else, the vast majority of the French people: peasants, laborers, artisans, shopkeepers, merchants, and professionals. Within this estate, there were many different lives, some poor and struggling, some comfortable and educated, but all bound together by the reality that they carried the greatest share of taxes and the heaviest burdens of work. Daily life for the majority of people in France, especially in the countryside, was tied closely to the land. Peasants rose early, their days filled with farming tasks, ploughing, sowing, harvesting, caring for animals. Their homes were simple, often built of wood or stone, with small windows and thatched or tiled roofs. Families gathered around a fire for warmth, their meals often made of bread, vegetables, and whatever they could afford or grow. Bread, in particular, was not just food but a necessity, so deeply woven into life that when bread became scarce or expensive, unrest spread quickly. Markets in towns bustled with activity, merchants calling out prices, stalls filled with cloth, tools, and food, voices mingling as neighbors exchanged both goods and news. Above this simple life of villages and towns stood the magnificence of Versailles, the grand palace built by Louis XIV, the Sun King, in the previous century. Versailles was more than a residence. It was a symbol of monarchy itself, a place of vast halls, glittering chandeliers, gardens that seemed to stretch endlessly, fountains that sparkled in the sunlight. There, King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette held court, surrounded by nobles in elaborate clothing, attending ceremonies, balls, and dinners of extraordinary richness. The contrast between Versailles and the villages of France was immense. In one, gold and music filled the air. In the other, the rhythm of labor shaped each day. Yet both were part of the same country, separated not by distance alone, but by the weight of privilege and duty. The monarchy had long been a central pillar of France, and many people still looked to the king as the source of order and tradition. Yet by the late 18th century, the crown carried heavy debts, built over years of wars and costly projects. The 7 Years' War, and later France's support for the American Revolution, had strained the treasury, and the lavish spending at Versailles added further pressure. To pay for these expenses, taxes were collected, but these fell most heavily on the Third Estate, the very people least able to bear them. While nobles and clergy were often exempt, or paid far less, peasants and townspeople carried the weight, leading to quiet resentment that grew slowly, like water seeping through stone. Ideas, too, were beginning to stir. The 18th century was a time of what historians call the Enlightenment, when philosophers, writers, and thinkers questioned old ways and imagined new ones. In salons and cafes, people read and debated the works of Rousseau, Voltaire, Montesquieu, and others, who spoke of liberty, equality, and reason. They questioned whether power should remain in the hands of a few, or whether all people had rights that should be recognized. These ideas spread beyond books, carried in conversations, whispered in the corners of gatherings, repeated in letters and pamphlets. They did not reach every village or every peasant, but they added a spark to the air, a sense that change, however distant, was possible. Paris, the heart of France, was a place where these currents were especially strong. Its streets were alive with noise, the clatter of carts, the calls of merchants, the laughter and quarrels of children, the steady hum of thousands of lives crossing one another. In the cafes, men discussed politics and philosophy. In workshops, artisans spoke of wages and prices. In homes, families spoke of the cost of bread and the uncertainty of the future. The city was vibrant, but it was also a place where inequality was felt most keenly, for the sight of wealth and privilege was never far from the sight of poverty and hunger. Amid all this, King Louis XVI was not a figure of tyranny in the way some kings had been, but he was uncertain, hesitant, and often indecisive. His queen, Marie Antoinette, was admired by some for her beauty and charm, but criticized by others for her spending and her foreign birth, being Austrian by origin. Together, they represented the monarchy at a time when the monarchy itself was being questioned. They lived surrounded by ceremony, yet distant from the struggles of their people, and this distance grew ever wider as France's financial troubles deepened. The church, too, still carried great influence. Bells marked the hours of each day, priests guided communities, festivals and holy days shaped the rhythm of the year. Yet the wealth of the higher clergy contrasted with the poverty of ordinary priests, and many common people began to feel that the church, like the nobility, held privileges that no longer seemed just. To see France before the storm of revolution is to see a country full of contrasts, wealth and poverty, tradition and new ideas, magnificence and simplicity. It was a land where ordinary people lived lives of routine, filled with work and family, while above them, nobles danced in glittering halls. It was a land where the king sat at the center of power, yet was increasingly unable to guide his kingdom through the storms of debt and discontent. It was a land where the old order seemed firm, yet beneath it, cracks were spreading quietly, slowly, and steadily. And so, as the 1780s unfolded, France remained beautiful, vibrant, and deeply divided. The fields still yielded their harvests, the markets still bustled, the Palace of Versailles still shone in the sunlight, but the balance that had held for centuries was beginning to shift. Like the air before a summer storm, the atmosphere was calm yet charged, the sky bright yet holding within it the promise of change. No one could yet know how great the changes would be, or how deeply they would reshape the nation. But already, the first quiet murmurs of discontent were stirring, and the people of France, though they did not know it, were standing on the threshold of a revolution. As the 1780s unfolded, France remained a place of deep beauty and long tradition, yet beneath its surface, the weight of troubles grew heavier each year. The countryside was still dotted with small villages where families worked the land, the rivers still carried barges of grain and goods, and the bells of churches still rang to mark the passing of time. But alongside these familiar sounds, there were other murmurs, whispers of worry spoken in low voices, carried in markets and along dusty roads. The murmurs were not yet loud enough to shake the old order, but they were steady, and they spread like ripples across still water. One of the greatest burdens upon the people of France was hunger. Bread was the heart of the French diet, and for many families, it was the most important part of their meals. A shortage of bread, or a rise in its price, could cause not only discomfort but real hardship. In years when harvests were poor, the price of bread rose sharply, and families found themselves struggling to afford even the simplest food. Mothers worried over how to feed their children. Fathers worried over how to keep their households steady, and the fear of hunger hung in the air like a shadow. In the countryside, peasants worked tirelessly, but much of what they produced was claimed in taxes, rents, and dues. In the cities, laborers who earned wages felt the rising prices most sharply, for no matter how hard they worked, the cost of bread often outpaced what they could bring home. Taxes were another burden, and they were not shared equally. The system of privilege allowed the clergy and nobility to pay little or sometimes nothing at all, while the third estate, farmers, workers, merchants, and professionals, carried the heaviest share. Each tax collector's visit was a reminder of imbalance, each levy a cause of quiet resentment. The taille, a direct tax on land, pressed heavily on peasants. The gabelle, a tax on salt, touched everyone, for salt was needed to preserve food. There were countless other duties and fees, small in isolation, but crushing when combined. To pay them, families sold goods, borrowed from neighbors, or went without. It was not only the amount, but the unfairness that stirred discontent, the knowledge that those with the most wealth and privilege gave the least. At the same time, the state itself was sinking deeper into debt. France had supported the American colonies in their struggle against Britain, sending ships, supplies, and money across the ocean. Though it brought pride to some to see Britain weakened, the cost was immense. Combined with the expenses of the royal court and the legacy of earlier wars, the treasury was nearly empty. Ministers of finance warned the king, suggesting reforms that might spread taxation more fairly, but each proposal met resistance. Nobles resisted losing their privileges, the court resisted losing its splendor, and so the burden remained where it had always been, on the third estate. And yet, these hardships were not born in silence alone. Ideas were stirring, ideas that questioned whether things must remain as they were. The Enlightenment had already planted seeds in the minds of many. In Paris, salons hosted by noblewomen and intellectuals brought together writers, philosophers, and curious listeners. And there, people discussed the works of Montesquieu, who had written of the separation of powers, Voltaire, who had questioned authority and spoken for tolerance, and Rousseau, who had written of the social contract and the sovereignty of the people. These ideas flowed through books and pamphlets, copied, debated, and carried into the wider world. In coffeehouses and taverns, ordinary men spoke of these ideas in simpler terms, asking whether it was right that so few should hold so much, and whether the voice of the people should not matter more than the will of a king or the privilege of a noble. In marketplaces, women who struggled to afford bread voiced their frustrations, and their words carried as much weight as the writings of philosophers, for they came directly from lived experience. Everywhere, there was a sense that something was out of balance, that the system of privilege and burden could not last forever. Yet these whispers of change were mixed with uncertainty. Many still respected the king, believing that if he only understood their suffering, he would act to relieve it. Louis XVI was not seen as cruel, but as indecisive, a man who hesitated when decisiveness was needed. Some hoped he might bring reform, that he might listen to his ministers and spread taxation more fairly. But his court was filled with competing voices, and his queen, Marie Antoinette, though not the reckless figure later legend made her, was often seen as out of touch, enjoying entertainments at Versailles, while bread grew scarce in Paris. The contrast between Versailles and the rest of France became a symbol in itself. In the palace, life was marked by ceremony, elaborate meals, dances, and the rituals of court. Nobles dressed in fine silks and jewels, walking through mirrored halls where every detail shone with luxury. Beyond the palace gates, peasants walked barefoot on rough ground, women wore plain dresses patched and repatched, and families slept in cottages with smoke-blackened beams. The distance was not only physical, but emotional, and each year it seemed to grow wider. In the late 1780s, poor harvests made matters worse. Heavy rains, cold winters, and bad weather brought thin crops, and bread once again became scarce and expensive. In the countryside, peasants watched their grain carried away by collectors, while their own tables remained bare. In the cities, long lines formed at bakeries, with women waiting anxiously for loaves that might not be enough to feed their families. Hunger sharpened the sense of injustice, turning quiet murmurs into sharper complaints. It was in these moments that whispers of change began to sound more like calls. And yet, through it all, the rhythm of life continued. Church bells still rang, children still played in the streets, markets still opened each morning with the sounds of sellers and buyers. Festivals and holy days still brought moments of joy, when neighbors gathered to share music and dance. But beneath the laughter, beneath the work and the prayers, there was a weight that could not be ignored. The people carried it in their steps, in their conversations, in their hopes that the future might somehow bring relief. The whispers of change were not yet shouts, but they were spreading. They carried through salons and streets, through pamphlets and letters, through markets and farms. They spoke of fairness, of reform, of the possibility that life could be different. And though the old order still seemed strong, its roots reaching deep into centuries of tradition, it was already beginning to loosen, as if the ground beneath it had begun to shift. France, before 1789, was a land of contrast, beauty and struggle, tradition and new ideas, wealth and hunger. The whispers of change did not yet tell of revolution, but they told of restlessness, of a people awakening slowly, to the thought that the way things had always been might not be the way they must always remain. And so, as each day passed, and each whisper carried to another ear, the air grew heavier with expectation. The storm had not yet broken, but the clouds were gathering, and France was listening. By the spring of 1789, the whispers of change that had drifted quietly through the towns and villages of France were beginning to gather into something stronger. Years of hunger, heavy taxes, and quiet frustration had built a pressure that could no longer be contained, and the king, urged by his advisors and the deep needs of the state, called for a gathering that had not been seen in France for more than a century. It was called the Estates General, and though it was meant at first to be a meeting to solve practical problems of money and debt, it would become something far greater, something that opened the way to revolution. The Estates General was an ancient assembly, a body where representatives of the three estates, the clergy, the nobility, and the common people, came together to advise the king. It had last met in 1614, so long ago that many in 1789 had never seen such a gathering in their lifetimes, and some doubted it would ever return. But France was in crisis. The treasury was nearly empty, creditors pressed for payment, and food shortages had made unrest a constant threat. To find new ways to raise funds, and perhaps to ease the burdens of the people, the king had little choice but to call the assembly. In towns and villages across France, the people were asked to elect representatives and to draw up lists of their grievances, called cahiers de doléances. These lists were filled with the voices of the Third Estate, written in the careful words of notaries, priests, or literate neighbors, yet carrying the concerns of farmers, artisans, merchants, and townsfolk. They asked for fairness in taxation, for relief from feudal dues, for access to hunting rights and common lands, for justice that was equal for all. Some spoke also of broader ideals, inspired by the Enlightenment, calling for liberty, equality, and their recognition of rights. Though many requests were practical and humble, together they painted a picture of a people weary of imbalance and ready for change. The elections themselves became moments of awakening. People gathered in parish churches or town halls, casting their voices in a process that gave them a sense of importance they had seldom felt. And though the system still favored the wealthier and more literate, it brought together men who might never have thought of themselves as part of national politics. For the first time, many felt that their thoughts and needs might reach beyond their village, carried to the great halls of Versailles where the Estates General would meet. When May arrived, representatives from across France made their way to Versailles, a journey filled with both excitement and uncertainty. They came on horseback, in carriages and on foot, carrying with them not only papers and petitions, but also the hopes of the people they represented. The clergy of the First Estate travelled in their robes, the nobles of the Second Estate in fine clothes, and the deputies of the Third Estate, lawyers, merchants, landowners, and a few farmers, wore more modest attire, plain but dignified. Versailles itself, with its grand halls and glittering mirrors, seemed far removed from the hunger and hardship of the villages, yet now it was filled with men who carried those concerns within them. The opening of the Estates General on May 5th was marked by ceremony, with the King and Queen present, their court surrounding them, and the hall alive with colour and sound. Louis XVI spoke of the need to resolve the financial crisis, and his ministers outlined proposals. Yet the deeper questions of fairness, of privilege, of representation were already present in the minds of many. The structure of the Estates General gave each estate one vote, the clergy as one body, the nobility as another, and the Third Estate as the third. This meant that, though the Third Estate represented the vast majority of the people, they could always be outvoted 2-1 by the privileged orders. For the deputies of the Third Estate, this was a bitter reality. They had come filled with the voices of their people, yet here they were reminded that those voices could still be silenced by tradition. In the early days of the meeting, the deputies of the Third Estate pressed for change. They argued that voting should be done not by estate, but by head, each representative having one vote, so that the greater number of the Third Estate could carry its weight. The nobles resisted, unwilling to surrender their advantage, and the clergy were divided, some siding with the nobility, others more sympathetic to the people. Debate stretched on, and the air in the halls grew heavy with frustration. Outside the halls, in Paris and in towns across France, people watched anxiously, waiting for signs of progress. Rumours spread quickly, and each delay was felt not only as political manoeuvring, but as another weight upon already burdened shoulders. Bread remained expensive, hunger remained sharp, and the people longed for relief that seemed always just beyond reach. As the days turned to weeks, the deputies of the Third Estate grew restless. They saw themselves locked out by privilege, their voices denied. On June 17th, they took a bold step. Declaring themselves the National Assembly, they claimed that they represented not just their estate, but the nation itself. It was a moment of quiet but profound change, a statement that sovereignty rested not in the king alone, nor in the privileged orders, but in the people. When they found themselves locked out of their meeting hall a few days later, perhaps by accident, perhaps by design, they gathered instead in a nearby indoor tennis court. And there, in the warmth of June, crowded together under the high ceiling, they took an oath, the famous tennis court oath, that they would not separate until they had given France a new constitution. Their words were simple, but their meaning was vast. They were committing themselves to a future that would reshape France, no matter the obstacles. This moment, gentle in its outward appearance, carried with it the energy of change. Men who had once been lawyers in small towns, merchants in bustling streets, or priests in humble parishes now stood as representatives of the people, their voices joined in unity. They were calm, determined, and steady, and in that stillness lay the strength of revolution. The king, faced with this defiance, hesitated. At times he seemed ready to grant reforms. At other times he listened to advisors who urged him to resist. His indecision only deepened the crisis. Meanwhile, more clergy and even some nobles began to join the assembly, drawn by the sense that history was shifting and that they could not remain apart from it. By the end of June, the National Assembly had grown stronger, and Versailles itself seemed to tremble with the weight of change. The Estates General, called to solve the problem of debt, had become something far more. It had awakened the voice of the people, drawn them into a national conversation, and set in motion events that could not be turned back. What had begun as whispers in markets and villages had now become declarations in halls and oaths in courts. The old structure of privilege and silence was beginning to crack, and through those cracks the light of a new order was beginning to shine. France in 1789 was still calm on the surface. Fields still yielded their crops, churches still rang their bells, and the palace of Versailles still glittered in the sun. But within its halls, within its assemblies, and within the hearts of its people, something irreversible had begun. The Estates General, after centuries of silence, had returned, and with its return the first true steps of revolution had been taken. The summer of 1789 had begun, and with it came a sense that France was moving into unfamiliar ground. The calling of the Estates General in May had stirred expectations, and when the deputies of the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly in June, those expectations grew stronger still. Yet the path ahead was unclear. The king hesitated between concession and resistance, the nobles clung to their privileges, and the people outside the halls of Versailles waited anxiously for signs of change. In this delicate balance, a single moment would become a symbol of unity and resolve, the day of the tennis court oath. The deputies of the Third Estate had long grown weary of being treated as lesser voices, despite representing the great majority of France's people. Their decision to form the National Assembly was both bold and steady, a quiet declaration that sovereignty lay not in estates or privileges, but in the nation itself. Yet even after this step, they faced obstacles. On the morning of June 20th, 1789, they found the doors to their usual meeting hall closed and locked, guarded by soldiers. Some said it was preparation for a royal session. Others believed it was an attempt to silence them. Whatever the reason, the deputies were left standing outside in the summer air, uncertain but unwilling to disperse. It was then that they moved to a nearby building, an indoor tennis court used for the game of jeu de paume. The space was large, with high walls and galleries, not designed for politics, but perfectly suited for the moment. The deputies crowded into the room, filling it with the sound of voices, the shuffle of feet, and the quiet determination that had carried them this far. There, beneath the vaulted ceiling and surrounded by the plain walls of the court, they made a solemn vow: they would not separate, they would not disperse, until they had given France a constitution. The words of the tennis court oath were simple, but their meaning was profound. It was no longer a matter of petitioning the king for relief, no longer a matter of asking politely for reforms. It was a commitment to reshape the very structure of France, to create laws that came from the people themselves, and to bind themselves together until the task was done. Each deputy raised his hand, some with trembling, some with steadiness, swearing the oath in unison. In that moment, they were no longer merely representatives. They were a body united by purpose, a symbol of a nation awakening. For those who stood there, the atmosphere was charged with a quiet intensity. They knew that their actions might bring danger. To defy tradition, to claim power apart from the king, was to risk accusation of treason. Yet the oath gave them strength, binding them together not only by words, but by solidarity. No one would face the challenge alone. Each would stand with the others, hand raised, voice steady, bound by a promise that echoed through the room and would echo through history. The scene was witnessed by an artist, Jacques-Louis David, who later sketched and planned a great painting of the event. Though unfinished, his vision captured the energy of that day, deputies standing with arms raised, the air alive with unity, even as storm clouds seemed to gather beyond the windows. The image, whether seen in art or imagined in memory, has become one of the revolution's defining moments, a moment when the people's representatives found their voice and declared their resolve. Outside the tennis court, word spread quickly. In Versailles, in Paris, and soon across France, people heard of the oath. They heard that the deputies had sworn never to separate, that they were determined to give the country a new foundation. For ordinary people who had long felt voiceless, it was a sign of hope, a sign that change was truly possible. For nobles and royal officials, it was a sign of danger, a step that challenged centuries of tradition and authority. The king, hearing of the oath, faced once again the choice that had so often stood before him, to accept reform or to resist. Louis XVI, hesitant by nature, tried to balance between the two. At first, he declared the assembly illegal, yet within days he relented, ordering the estates to meet together. His indecision only deepened the sense that power was slipping away from the monarchy and into the hands of the people who now spoke through their representatives. The tennis court oath was more than a single act. It was a turning point, a threshold. Before it, the revolution was a matter of discontent, of grievances, of requests for reform. After it, the revolution became a matter of resolve, of determination to create something new, even in the face of resistance. It was a quiet promise, made in a plain hall, but it carried within it the energy of a storm. For the deputies themselves, the oath gave strength in the days that followed. They continued to meet, to debate, to argue over details and principles, yet always with the knowledge that they were bound together by that vow. The National Assembly began to take on the shape of a true legislature, drafting ideas, considering laws, and preparing for the immense task of writing a constitution. Though disagreements remained, the memory of the tennis court reminded them that they shared a larger purpose, one that rose above their differences. For the people outside Versailles, the oath became a story told and retold. In Parisian cafes, in village squares, in letters passed between friends, the words were repeated. The deputies had sworn to remain together. The image of hands raised in unity spread across the land, stirring imaginations, feeding hopes, and strengthening the belief that the world was changing. And yet, as the summer moved forward, the tensions continued to grow. Hunger did not vanish, debts did not disappear, and the divisions between estates and classes did not dissolve overnight. The tennis court oath was a symbol, but symbols alone could not ease the weight of bread shortages or the frustration of taxes. Still, it gave the people something new, a vision of representatives who stood for them, who spoke in their name, and who promised not to abandon their cause. In the quiet of the evening, when the day's debates were done and the deputies returned to their lodgings, the oath remained in their minds. As some wrote in their journals of the moment, others carried it silently, but all felt the weight of the promise. They knew that what they had done could not be undone. They had bound themselves to history, and history was now moving forward with them. The tennis court oath, remembered now as a scene of raised arms and steady voices, was at its heart an act of patience and resolve. It did not call for violence, it did not shout with anger, it simply promised to endure. And in that promise lay the strength of the revolution, a strength that would carry France through the storms to come. The summer of 1789 in Paris was heavy with heat, hunger, and uncertainty. Bread remained scarce, prices remained high, and each day the people of the city felt the weight of worry in their steps. Crowds gathered at bakeries in the early hours, hoping for loaves that might not arrive. Families stretched small meals to feed many mouths. Rumors drifted through the air like dust, rumors of troops gathering, of plots to silence the National Assembly, of dangers not yet seen but deeply felt. The tension was quiet but steady, like the pressure in the air before a storm. The Bastille, a fortress built in the 14th century, stood in the eastern part of Paris. Its tall stone walls, towers, and heavy gates made it a looming presence, though by 1789 it was not heavily used as a prison. Inside, only a handful of prisoners remained, yet the Bastille was not feared for who it held, but for what it symbolized. For generations, kings had used it to confine those who opposed them, sending people there with letters of order called lettres de cachet, signed by royal authority without need for trial. To the people, the Bastille stood as a symbol of tyranny, of secrecy, of the power of the crown to silence without answer. And though its cells were not full, its shadow fell wide. As July began, King Louis XVI had called troops toward Paris, hoping to steady the unrest. Soldiers marched near the city, and cannons were placed where they could be seen. To the people of Paris, this was not reassurance, but threat. They feared that the king would use force to dissolve the National Assembly, to undo the promises made in the tennis court oath, to silence the voices that had begun to speak. Anxiety grew with each sight of uniforms, each rumor of plans, whispered in the crowded streets. On July 12th, a popular speaker named Camille Desmoulins stood before a crowd, calling for vigilance, urging the people to resist. His words spread quickly, and demonstrations began, filling the streets with energy. Shops closed, bells rang, and the city seemed to pulse with a restless rhythm. The search for weapons began, first in armories, then in other stores. Muskets were seized, but powder and shot were scarce. And so attention turned to the Bastille, where not only gunpowder but also the heavy symbol of royal power remained. On the morning of July 14th, crowds gathered near the fortress. At first, they asked for powder and arms, their voices raised but their steps hesitant. Negotiations began, slow and uncertain. The governor of the Bastille, Bernard-René de Launay, spoke with delegates from the crowd, agreeing at times, resisting at others. Hours passed, the sun climbed higher and the air grew heavy with impatience. By midday, the crowd pressed harder, surging toward the gates while soldiers and guards within prepared to defend. The first shots rang out, sharp against the murmur of voices. Smoke drifted through the air, cries rose from the crowd, and the calm of the morning dissolved into chaos. For hours, the battle continued, the people pressing forward with determination, the defenders firing from the walls. Cannon fire roared, muskets cracked, and the fortress that had stood for centuries shook with the force of the assault. The people of Paris, armed with seized muskets, axes, and sheer resolve, refused to withdraw. Their numbers grew as more joined, drawn by the sound of conflict and the sight of their neighbors at the gates. By late afternoon, the defenders realized that resistance could not last. Supplies dwindled, morale weakened, and the pressure of the crowd was too great. The governor agreed to surrender, and the gates were opened. The people surged inside, filling the courtyards, climbing the towers, searching the rooms that had long been shrouded in secrecy. Chains were found, cells were opened, and though only a handful of prisoners emerged, the image of their release carried enormous weight. The fall of the Bastille was not about numbers or military value. It was about symbolism. The fortress, long seen as a dark shadow of oppression, had been taken by the people themselves. It was a declaration, louder than any pamphlet or speech, that the old order could be challenged, that the people could rise against power and prevail. Words spread swiftly, carried by riders, by letters, by voices eager to tell what had happened. In Paris, bells rang, crowds cheered, and neighbors embraced. Across France, the news brought astonishment and inspiration. For King Louis XVI, the fall of the Bastille was a moment of awakening. When he first heard the news, he is said to have asked if it was a revolt. The reply he received was simple and profound. "No, sire, it is a revolution." The difference between the two was vast. A revolt was a spark, a disturbance that might be put down. A revolution was a tide, a turning of the world that could not easily be reversed. The day of July 14th became more than a single event. It became a symbol of the revolution itself. Each year after, it would be remembered, celebrated as armament when the people's voice was heard in stone and smoke. For those who had been there, who had felt the press of the crowd, the heat of the sun, the roar of cannon, it was a memory etched deeply. For those who heard of it later, it was a story that gave courage, a reminder that even the most imposing walls could fall when the people stood together. And yet, beneath the celebration there was also uncertainty. The fall of the Bastille did not end hunger, did not erase debts, did not instantly create a new constitution. It was a beginning, a spark that lit the path ahead, but the road remained long and difficult. Still, for the people of France, July 14th was proof that change was possible. The Bastille, once a symbol of fear, was now a symbol of freedom. In the quiet of the evening, as the smoke cleared and the sun set over Paris, the people walked home through streets filled with both exhaustion and exhilaration. They carried with them not only muskets and powder, but also a sense of dignity newly claimed. The revolution had found its emblem, and France had stepped into a new chapter of its history. The fall of the Bastille in July of 1789 did not only bring down the walls of a fortress, it sent ripples through every corner of France, carrying with it a sense that the world was shifting. The great stone towers had crumbled not just in Paris, but in the imagination of the people. What had seemed unshakable was shown to be vulnerable. What had seemed untouchable was brought down by ordinary hands. Across towns and villages, in markets and fields, the story was told and retold, and with each telling it grew into something larger. France, long held in patterns of privilege and tradition, was beginning to awaken. The weeks that followed July 14th were filled with both excitement and fear. In Paris, the National Assembly continued its work, emboldened by the support shown in the streets. The king, uneasy and uncertain, visited the city and was met not with rebellion but with cheers, though behind those cheers lay the knowledge that power was shifting away from him. The people had found their strength, and the assembly had found its voice. The old balance was gone, replaced by something new and untested. In the countryside, news of the Bastille mingled with older fears. The summer was hot, harvests uncertain, and rumors drifted like smoke from one village to another. Some said armies of brigands were roaming the land, hired by nobles to punish peasants. Others whispered that food was being hoarded, that grain was hidden away to raise prices. These stories, often without truth, spread quickly, for hunger made ears sharp and fear made imaginations restless. The result was what came to be known as the Great Fear, a wave of panic that swept through rural France. Peasants, anxious and determined, armed themselves with tools, scythes, and old muskets. They gathered in groups, ready to defend their homes and families against enemies that often never arrived. And when their fear turned outward, they marched to the houses of local lords, demanding grain, burning records of feudal dues, and sometimes tearing down symbols of noble privilege. For centuries, peasants had lived under the weight of obligations, paying rents, owing labor, surrendering part of their harvests. Now, in the charged air of 1789, they began to cast those burdens aside. The great fear was not simply panic, it was also release, a breaking of chains long resented. Back in Paris, the National Assembly watched these events unfold with both alarm and recognition. The revolution was no longer only in the halls of Versailles or the streets of the capital. It was in every village, every farmhouse, every field. To calm the unrest and to respond to the demands of the people, the Assembly took one of its boldest steps. On the night of August 4th, 1789, deputies rose one after another to renounce feudal privileges. Nobles gave up hunting rights, seigneurial dues, and the ancient exemptions from taxation. Clergy offered to end the collection of tithes. The session stretched late into the night, voices carrying with a mix of solemnity and relief. By dawn, the old order of feudal obligations had been declared abolished. For the peasants, this decree was transformative. Though it would take time for the details to be written and enforced, the symbolism was immediate. No longer would they bow to the weight of centuries-old obligations. No longer would the nobles' rights stretch over every field and forest. A new equality, still fragile but declared, had begun. Only weeks later, the Assembly went further, drafting one of the most famous documents of the Revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Inspired by Enlightenment ideas, by the American Declaration of Independence, and by the voices of their own people, the deputies wrote of principles that seemed simple yet profound. All men, they declared, were born and remained free and equal in rights. Sovereignty rested in the nation, not in a king. Liberty consisted in the freedom to do anything that did not harm another. The law was the same for all, whether it protected or punished. Rights to property, security, and resistance to oppression were affirmed. The Declaration was read in calm, clear language, its tone measured but resolute. For those who heard it, it was like a new dawn breaking. For centuries, laws had favored privilege. Now, at least in principle, they promised equality. For centuries, power had been seen as descending from the crown. Now it was said to rise from the people. The words were not yet reality, and much would depend on how they were applied, but they set forth a vision of France renewed. Outside the Assembly, life continued with its mix of hardship and hope. In Paris, crowds still pressed at bakeries for bread, women still waited long hours in lines, and men still spoke anxiously in cafes of the price of grain. In villages, families still worked their fields with the same care as before, the rhythm of planting and harvesting, unchanged by declarations made in distant halls. Yet in every loaf of bread, in every furrow turned in the soil, there was now a sense that something greater was at stake. People felt that their struggles were connected to a larger story, that their voices, long unheard, had begun to matter. The king, meanwhile, struggled to adapt to this awakening. Louis XVII signed decrees, listened to advisors, and hesitated, as he so often did, between acceptance and resistance. His queen, Marie Antoinette, grew more isolated, criticized for extravagance that was sometimes exaggerated but always resented. The monarchy still stood, but it was no longer unchallenged. The people no longer bowed so easily, and the Assembly no longer deferred so quickly. As summer turned to autumn, France was alive with change. The Bastille had fallen, the Great Fear had swept the countryside, feudalism had been abolished, and Reich had been declared. Each of these steps carried both promise and peril, for they raised hopes that could not easily be satisfied. The nation was awakening, stretching after a long sleep, blinking in the light of new ideas, and discovering both its strength and its uncertainty. When we look back now, the events of 1789 seem swift and inevitable, but to those who lived them, they were confusing, unpredictable, filled with both joy and fear. One day brought celebration, the next brought anxiety. One decree promised freedom, another brought questions of how it would be carried out. Yet through it all, the sense of awakening was clear. France was stirring, rising, discovering itself anew. And in the quiet evenings, when the debates of the assembly were done, when the markets had closed, when families gathered around their fires, people spoke in hushed tones of what they had seen and heard. They spoke of privileges ended, of rights declared, of the future opening like a path through unfamiliar woods. They did not know where it would lead, but they knew they were walking it together. The revolution, once whispers, was now a voice. A nation that had long lived under the weight of silence and privilege was beginning to speak. Its words were still unsteady, its steps still uncertain, but its awakening was undeniable. As the summer of 1789 turned into autumn, the balance between the monarchy and the people grew more delicate with each passing week. The fall of the Bastille had shown that the people of Paris could act with strength. The Great Fear had revealed the restlessness of the countryside, and the National Assembly had begun to reshape laws and principles with sweeping declarations. The king, once at the center of power beyond question, now stood in a world that was changing quickly around him. Louis XVI, cautious and hesitant, tried to hold on to the crown's dignity, yet the people's gaze grew sharper and their patience thinner. Versailles, the grand palace that had once seemed so secure, became a symbol of distance. While families in Paris waited in long lines for bread, while peasants in the countryside toiled to pay their taxes, the court at Versailles appeared to live in another world. The halls still glittered with chandeliers, the gardens still shimmered with fountains, and nobles still attended ceremonies, banquets, and dances. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, was often singled out as a figure of extravagance. Though not all of the stories told about her were true, her reputation for luxury became a lightning rod for anger. In pamphlets and gossip, she was mocked as Madame Deficit, blamed for the debts of France, and accused of saying, falsely but famously, "Let them eat cake." Bread remained at the heart of discontent. By October, the harvest had been poor, and the price of bread had risen again. For ordinary people, this was not an abstract issue, but a daily struggle. A loaf of bread could cost more than half a laborer's daily wage, and many families went hungry. In the markets of Paris, women spoke of their anger openly, their voices carrying the sharpness of hunger. Mothers worried for their children, wives worried for their households, and all knew that words alone would not fill their stomachs. It was in this atmosphere that one of the most remarkable episodes of the Revolution unfolded, the Marche on Versailles. On October 5th, 1789, a crowd of women gathered in the marketplaces of Paris, angry over the scarcity of bread and the high prices. Their numbers grew quickly, joined by others, men and women alike, until thousands filled the streets. Some carried pikes or muskets, many carried makeshift weapons, but all carried the same demand, bread and relief. The march began in the rain, the long road to Versailles muddy beneath their feet, drums beating a steady rhythm as they moved forward. The women of the march were not politicians or philosophers. They were market women, housewives, servants, ordinary Parisians who had taken their desperation into their own hands. Their voices rose in chants and songs as they walked, their determination as steady as the autumn rain. As they drew closer to Versailles, more joined them, National Guardsmen drawn by duty or sympathy, adding a measure of order to the great column of humanity moving toward the palace. At Versailles, the court was caught unprepared. The sight of thousands at the gates was a shock, and the noise of the crowd carried into the gilded halls. The women demanded to see the king, to present their grievances, to ask for bread. Some entered the palace itself, their wet clothes and muddy shoes, a stark contrast to the polished floors and shimmering walls. Tension filled the air, sharp and uneasy, as the distance between ruler and people narrowed in those crowded rooms. Louis XVI, cautious and uncertain as ever, agreed to meet with representatives of the marchers. He promised to provide grain for Paris, to hear their concerns, and to remain attentive to the needs of his people. For some, this was enough to calm their anger. But the unrest was not so easily soothed. The next day, violence broke out inside the palace, as some in the crowd clashed with guards. Doors were broken, shots were fired, and chaos surged through the corridors. Marie Antoinette herself was forced to flee from her chambers, seeking safety. Amid the turmoil, the crowd pressed its demand further. The king must come to Paris. The idea was simple but powerful. If the king lived among the people, he could no longer ignore their struggles. And surrounded by their hunger, their voices, their demands, he would have to see and hear them every day. Reluctantly, Louis XVI agreed. And so, on October 6th, the king and queen, their children, and their retinue left Versailles. Their carriage rolled slowly along the road, surrounded by the vast procession of marchers. Some carried loaves of bread aloft like trophies, others sang and shouted, their cries filling the air. The Palace of Versailles, once the proud center of monarchy, was left behind, its golden halls abandoned to silence. The King of France was now bound to Paris, bound to his people, bound to a city that no longer revered him as untouchable, but demanded him as accountable. For the people of Paris, the arrival of the royal family was a moment of triumph. Crowds filled the streets, cheering, pressing close to see the monarch who had come to live among them. The move was more than physical, it was symbolic. The distance between crown and people had been reduced, the aura of majesty diminished. The revolution had entered a new phase, one where the king was no longer apart, no longer at Versailles, but at the very heart of the capital, under the watchful eyes of his subjects. The king and queen took residence at the Tuileries Palace in Paris, a place far less grand than Versailles, and there they lived under the uneasy balance of power that now defined their reign. Louis XVI still held the title of king, but real authority was slipping steadily to the assembly and to the streets. The people, who had once bowed silently, now raised their voices openly. The revolution, once an awakening, was becoming a force that pressed upon every corner of daily life. The March on Versailles showed something profound about the revolution, that it was not only shaped by assemblies and declarations, but also by the direct action of ordinary people. Women, who were often excluded from formal politics, had played a central role, their voices and footsteps carrying the force of hunger and the demand for dignity. Their march had changed the course of history, bringing the king to Paris, reshaping the balance of power, and showing that the revolution was not confined to speeches and oaths, but lived in the streets, in the marketplaces, and in the determination of those who would not be ignored. When evening fell on Paris after the march, the city was alive with noise and light. Fires burned in the squares, voices sang and shouted, and the sense of victory mingled with the uncertainty of what would come next. Families sat together, speaking of the day's events in hushed or excited tones, children listening wide-eyed to stories of their mothers and neighbors who had marched to Versailles. The king was now in their city, within reach, no longer distant in a palace of mirrors. It was a change so profound that it reshaped how people thought of monarchy itself. The king and the people were now bound together, not by tradition alone, but by necessity, by hunger, by the demands of a revolution that would not be turned back. And in this binding, in this uneasy closeness, France took another step forward into the unknown path of its awakening. By the time the royal family had settled uneasily into the Tuileries Palace in Paris, the revolution had already carried France far from the world it had once known. The Bastille had fallen, feudal privileges had been swept away, rights had been declared, and the king himself now lived under the watchful eyes of his people. Yet change once set in motion did not stop. Each month seemed to bring new questions, new debates, and new struggles. What had begun as a call for reform deepened into something far larger, reshaping the very foundations of society. The National Assembly continued its work, meeting day after day in Paris. Its deputies, once gathered in defiance at a tennis court, were now writing laws, debating principles, and seeking to give form to the ideals they had declared. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen had set forth broad truths, but how were those truths to be made real in daily life? Could equality truly exist while the monarchy still stood? Could liberty be secure while enemies, both within and beyond France, opposed it? These questions filled the air, turning each session of the Assembly into long hours of talk, compromise, and dispute. Outside the halls of government, Paris itself was alive with political energy. In cafes, clubs, and on street corners, people gathered to discuss the latest news. Pamphlets poured from printing presses, carrying arguments and accusations, spreading quickly through the city and into the countryside. The voices of the revolution multiplied, and with them came new leaders who stirred crowds with fiery words. And clubs such as the Jacobins became places where men of passion and conviction argued for stronger measures, for deeper change, for vigilance against enemies. The revolution was no longer the work of a few. It had become the work of many, each voice adding to the chorus, each word pushing the tide a little further. At the same time, divisions grew sharper. Some believed the revolution had already gone far enough, that France could find balance with a constitutional monarchy where the king remained but with limited powers. Others argued that monarchy itself was incompatible with liberty, that the king could not be trusted, that the people alone must hold sovereignty. These differences did not remain polite. They echoed in speeches, in pamphlets, and sometimes in the streets, where crowds showed their approval or disapproval, with noise, with cheers, with anger. The presence of the royal family in Paris added to the tension. Louis XVI tried to appear cooperative, attending sessions of the Assembly, signing decrees, and promising loyalty to the new order. Yet rumors whispered that he plotted secretly to restore full power, that he sought help from foreign kings, that his acceptance of change was only a mask. Marie Antoinette, already distrusted, was accused of urging resistance, of writing letters to her Austrian family, of dreaming of rescue. Whether all of these suspicions were true or not, they deepened the sense that the monarchy could not be relied upon, and that vigilance was necessary. The people of Paris kept watch with restless energy. The National Guard patrolled the streets, citizens attended meetings of local assemblies, and newspapers reported every move of the king and queen. The revolution was not only debated in grand halls, but lived in daily life, in the price of bread, in the tone of a pamphlet, in the mood of a crowd gathered at a square. Each act by the assembly, each word from the king, seemed to ripple outward, felt by thousands whose patience had grown thin from years of hunger and hardship. In June of 1791, the unease reached a dramatic point. The king and his family attempted to flee Paris, hoping to reach loyal troops near the border and perhaps restore authority from there. Disguised and traveling by carriage, they slipped away in the night, only to be recognized and stopped at Varennes, a small town along their route. Brought back to Paris under guard, their escape attempt shattered what trust remained. To many, it was proof that the king was not a partner in the revolution, but an obstacle to it. The sight of the royal carriage returning, surrounded by silent crowds who watched with cold suspicion, marked a turning of hearts. The bond between king and people, strained for months, was now nearly broken. Meanwhile, outside France, the revolution stirred alarm. Monarchs of other countries watched uneasily as France dismantled privilege, declared rights, and challenged the thievery idea of kingship. They feared the example might spread to their own lands, that their own people might awaken to similar demands. Whispers of intervention began, of coalitions to restore the French crown, of armies that might march. The revolution, once a national matter, was becoming international, its energy spilling beyond borders. Inside France, the deepening of the revolution brought both hope and fear. Hope, because people saw privileges fall, saw rights declared, saw the assembly continue its work despite obstacles. Fear, because the pace of change brought uncertainty, because divisions grew wider, and because the possibility of conflict seemed always near. In the countryside, peasants adjusted to their new freedoms, while in the cities, workers pressed for fair wages and relief from hunger. Each group carried its own hopes, its own demands, and together they created a landscape both vibrant and unstable. The clubs and societies that flourished in Paris became voices of the people, speaking loudly and often harshly against enemies, real and imagined. Leaders rose, some calm, some fiery, each urging vigilance, each declaring that the revolution must be defended at any cost. Crowds filled the streets to hear them, their words repeated and carried from mouth to mouth. The revolution was deepening, not only in laws and decrees, but in the hearts and minds of those who lived it. And through it all, the ordinary rhythms of life continued. Bakers still rose before dawn to knead their bread, though flour was dear and customers anxious. Farmers still bent to their fields, though the weather and markets remained uncertain. Families still gathered in the evenings, though their conversations turned often to politics, to rumors, to the future. Life did not pause for revolution, it carried on, yet each task, each moment was colored by the knowledge that France was changing. By 1792, the revolution had entered a phase that none could ignore. The monarchy stood weakened, the assembly grew bolder, the people more restless, and the nations of Europe more wary. What had begun as whispers had become speeches, what had begun as petitions had become decrees, what had begun as reform was becoming transformation. The revolution was no longer about balance, it was about the very soul of France and the question of who truly held its power. And so, as nights grew long and fires burned in hearths across the land, people spoke in quiet tones of what lay ahead. They did not yet know of the storms to come, of the terror that would cast its shadow, of the wars that would sweep across borders. But they knew with certainty that the revolution was deepening, that the old world was gone, and that France was walking a path from which there could be no return. By 1793, the revolution had travelled far from the hopeful declarations of its first years. What had begun as a call for reform, then deepened into the removal of feudal privilege and the drafting of new rights, was now entering its darkest season. France was at war with neighbouring monarchies, divisions within the country had sharpened, and the unity that had once carried people forward was fraying. The voices of hope had not disappeared, but they were joined, and sometimes drowned by voices of suspicion, of fear, and of urgency. What came to be called the Reign of Terror was not a sudden storm, but a gathering of shadows, an atmosphere that spread slowly, settling over the land like a heavy mist. The execution of King Louis XVI in January of 1793 was one of the turning points. The decision had not been unanimous, but the Assembly had voted for his death, believing that the revolution could not move forward while monarchy lingered. The guillotine, with its sharp blade, carried out the sentence in the public square. To some it was justice, to others it was sorrow, to all it was a sign that the world had shifted. The figure of the king, once the center of French life, was gone, and with him went centuries of tradition. Yet his death did not bring calm. Instead, it opened the door to new uncertainties, new divisions, and new fears. France was now surrounded by enemies. Austria, Prussia, Britain, and other monarchies moved against it, alarmed by the fall of the king and determined to prevent revolution from spreading to their own lands. Armies marched, battles were fought along borders, and French citizens were called upon to defend their nation. The war demanded resources, demanded soldiers, demanded loyalty. Those who hesitated, those who resisted, were seen with suspicion. Inside France, divisions grew sharper. Some regions, such as the Vendée, rose in rebellion, unwilling to accept the new order, loyal still to monarchy or church. In Paris, radical clubs called for vigilance, for rooting out traitors, for pushing the revolution further. Newspapers and pamphlets filled with accusations, pointing fingers at enemies real and imagined. Fear spread through streets and homes, for suspicion could fall on anyone, on nobles who seemed too comfortable, on priests who resisted reforms, on merchants accused of hoarding grain, even on neighbors whose words were careless. The guillotine became the most visible symbol of this season. In the Place de la Révolution, crowds gathered daily as the blade fell, claiming the lives of those judged to be enemies of the Republic. Among them were nobles, clergy, former allies of the revolution, and even some of its leaders who had fallen out of favor. The rhythm of the executions became part of the city's life, drums rolling, carts carrying the condemned, the silence of the moment before the blade, and then the murmurs of the crowd. It was a ritual both solemn and grim, one that reflected the fear and urgency of the time. Yet beyond the guillotine, the terror was also felt in quieter ways. In villages, people lowered their voices when speaking of politics, careful of who might overhear. In homes, letters were burned or hidden, for a phrase written incautiously might be read as disloyalty. Families worried not only about hunger and war, but about being accused. Trust, once given freely among neighbors, was often shadowed by doubt. The revolution, which had once promised equality and rights, now carried also the weight of suspicion and control. The leaders of this time, men like Maximilien Robespierre, Georges Danton, and Jean-Paul Marat, believed they were defending the revolution from enemies within and without. They spoke of virtue, of the need for purity, of the danger of compromise. And to them, the guillotine was not cruelty, but necessity, a way to protect the fragile new republic from collapse. Yet the very zeal that gave them conviction also fed the fear that spread through France. The line between justice and vengeance blurred, and the revolution, once a source of hope, cast long shadows across the land. And yet, even in this season of terror, ordinary life continued. And fields were still ploughed, markets still opened, families still gathered around their hearths. The laughter of children could still be heard in courtyards, the tolling of church bells still marked the hours, the rhythms of life still beat quietly beneath the louder drums of politics and war. The people endured, as they always had, finding moments of comfort in familiar tasks, even as the world around them felt uncertain. In time, the terror began to consume even those who had guided it. Leaders who once stood united against monarchy turned against one another, accusing, condemning, falling in turn beneath the same blade they had once defended. Danton, once a powerful voice, was executed. Robespierre, whose stern vision had dominated, followed not long after. The cycle of suspicion had grown so sharp that it cut through its own makers, leaving France weary of blood and fear. By the summer of 1794, the terror had begun to ebb. The executions slowed, the atmosphere lightened, and the people, though still facing hunger and war, began to hope for calmer days. The revolution had survived its darkest season, but it had changed in the process. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity were still spoken, but they carried the weight of memories of fear, of silence, of neighbors lost to suspicion. The shadows of terror did not erase the revolution, but they left marks upon it, marks that would not easily fade. They reminded all who lived through them that even the brightest hopes could be dimmed by fear, that even the most noble ideas could be clouded by suspicion. And yet, they also reminded the people of their endurance, of their ability to carry on through hardship, to wait patiently for the return of calmer days. When we think of the terror now, it is easy to see only the guillotine, the crowds, the fear. But it is also gentle to remember the quieter scenes, the family sitting in silence, hoping for safety, the farmer tending his field despite worry, the neighbor who offered a loaf of bread when another had none. And these moments of quiet humanity, steady and enduring, are what allowed France to emerge from the shadows, to step once more toward the light of a new dawn. When the terror ended in the summer of 1794, France was left weary and unsettled, like a traveler who had crossed a dark and stormy valley and now stood blinking in the quiet of morning. The blade of the guillotine no longer fell with its relentless rhythm. The shouts of accusation no longer echoed so fiercely in the assembly, and the fear that had shadowed daily life began, little by little, to lift. Yet the land carried the memory of those days, and its people carried the marks of endurance. The revolution had survived, but it was no longer the same as it had been in its hopeful beginnings. It was something changed, tempered by hardship, and still searching for the shape it would finally take. The fall of Robespierre in July of 1794 was both sudden and decisive. The man who had once spoken of virtue and the need for vigilance was himself condemned, carried to the same scaffold that had claimed so many before him. His death brought an end to the government of fear, but it did not bring instant peace. The nation was still at war with foreign powers, still struggling with debt and hunger, still divided by memories of bloodshed. Yet the silence after his fall was different. It was not the silence of fear, but the silence of relief, of a people who longed to breathe again after too many months of suspicion. In the years that followed, France entered a period known as the Directory. Power shifted once again, this time to a group of 5 directors who governed together. They sought to steady the Republic, to balance the extremes of radical zeal and royalist resistance. The Directory was not a time of great glory, nor of deep terror. It was a time of adjustment, of cautious steps, of trying to find equilibrium after years of upheaval. For the people, it meant that life continued much as before. Bread remained dear, taxes remained heavy, and were still called men to arms. But it also meant that the guillotine no longer cast such a constant shadow, and that was enough to give hope of calmer days. In villages and towns, people turned once more to the tasks that had always sustained them. Farmers ploughed and sowed, bakers rose before dawn to knead their dough, craftsmen worked their tools with quiet skill. Families gathered at tables, not always with plenty, but with gratitude that the worst seemed behind them. Children grew, new marriages were celebrated, songs were sung once again at festivals. The revolution had shaken France, but the resilience of its people carried them forward, steady as the flow of rivers, patient as the turning of seasons. And yet, the revolution had also planted seeds that could not be forgotten. The Declaration of the Rights of Man still echoed in memory, its words of liberty and equality held close by those who had once known only privilege and burden. The idea that sovereignty rested in the nation, that laws should be the same for all, that citizens had rights that Norelaire could take away. These were truths that would not vanish, even when the times grew uncertain. They were whispered in homes, taught to children, carried in hearts. The revolution had given France not only new laws, but a new vision of what it could be. Beyond France, the world had taken notice. Monarchs watched uneasily, some with fear, some with determination to resist, others with curiosity at how Succedius might travel. In distant lands, people spoke of liberty, of rights, of the example set by the French. The revolution was no longer only a national event. It had become a moment in the history of humanity, a sign that change, once thought impossible, could indeed take place. And as the decade drew to a close, another figure began to rise, a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte. His victories on the battlefield brought pride to a nation weary of war, and his energy promised new direction. In 1799, he would seize power, ending the Directory and beginning a new chapter of France's story. Under him, the revolution's legacy would continue in altered form, carried into new laws, new wars, and new empires. But that was still ahead, and in the quiet years after the Terror, France remained in a delicate balance, still finding its way. For those who lived through the revolution, the memory of its earliest days remained vivid. They remembered the excitement of 1789, the fall of the Bastille, the joy of seeing feudal burdens lifted, the hope carried by the Declaration of Rights. They remembered also the shadows, the fear, the silence of suspicion, the neighbors lost. And in remembering, they understood that the revolution had been both light and darkness, both hope and sorrow, both a breaking and a building. When we look back now, it is tempting to see the revolution as a line of great events: the Bastille, the March on Versailles, the King's execution, the Terror, the rise of Napoleon. But to those who lived it, it was a matter of daily endurance, of waiting in breadlines, of speaking cautiously, of hoping for letters from the front, of carrying on in times of change. It was not only shaped by assemblies and decrees, but by the quiet strength of ordinary people. And so, the revolution closed its first chapter not with a final shout, but with a long, weary sigh. The monarchy was gone, the people had spoken, and a republic stood in its place. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with new struggles, new leaders, new challenges. But the idea that had awakened in 1789, that the people could shape their own destiny, remained alive. In the evenings, when the sun set over the fields and the streets of Paris grew quiet, families once again gathered by firelight. They spoke of the past with both pride and sadness, of the friends they had lost, of the changes they had seen, of the hope that their children would grow up in a world more just than the one they had known. And in those moments, the revolution lived on, not in the noise of guillotines or the roar of crowds, but in the gentle voices of people imagining a future built on liberty, equality, and fraternity. The dawn that followed the shadows was not perfect, nor was it free of hardship. But it was dawn nonetheless. The night had been long, the storm had been fierce, but France had emerged changed, awakened, and ready to continue walking forward, step by steady step, into the unknown future.